Whole new way to think about sales planning, execution, and
Hi everyone, welcome to Denver Startup Week. Happy day 3. I'm Ashley Cloud, People Track Chair and member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Thank you so much for attending our first virtual Denver Startup Week. One of my very favorite things about startups is that we're constantly trying new things and learning as we go. So that's definitely what we're doing for our first virtual Denver Startup Week. So we just thanks in advance for going on this journey with us, for trying something new together, for your graciousness, your patience, and kindness as we work through any technical kinks throughout the week. At Denver Startup Week, we strive to make all of our sessions a space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, regardless of age, gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, sexual orientation, or the combination of any of those. We try to make sure there's something for everyone and that everyone sees themselves in Denver Startup Week. A few things coming up after this session. At 2 p.m., we have This Land Was Made for You and Me, Diversity and Inclusion in Outdoor Recreation. At 4 p.m., we have Startup Cribs, Does Place Still Matter? And at 5 o'clock, for anyone that needs a little de-stressing and joy in their life, we have our annual puppy panel. So virtually, of course, but who doesn't need more puppies in their life? So we appreciate our sponsors, especially our People Track sponsor, Exactly, our volunteers, our session organizers, and our community. This is our 9th year of doing this, and we couldn't do it without you. So thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to use the hashtag Den Startup Week on social to keep connecting. And thanks so much for joining this session today. Black and brown investors matter, because they definitely do. Let's listen and engage with the session as our panel shares experiences on how to build a plan to engage angels of color to invest in founders of color. Thanks so much. Now to Peter.
Thanks, Ashley. Appreciate it. Glad to be here. And I just want to say this is a really exciting panel, and I just am so proud of the folks that we have here. We have really some of the most impressive folks who've got great experience and opinions on this topic. So I'm going to queue up my screen here for you and share that. And so just to sort of talk about this topic, here's our thesis, is that there are significant barriers to Black and brown founders of startups and getting access to capital. So we think there's a lot of reasons for that, and it's super complex, and we want to narrow this down to sort of understanding how is it that we can engage Black and brown investors to invest in Black and brown startups. And so we want to, in this session, be talking about all of the barriers that we can. So we're pretty clear on why this is difficult, and then also identify as many solutions as we can. So this is a session where we're going to be trying to get a lot of outcomes and things that we can put into action. So it's not, hopefully, not just a bunch of talking heads, but it'll be something where we're actually developing something. So I'm Peter Adams, Executive Director at Rockies Venture Club and Managing Partner at Rockies Venture Fund and Pandemic Impact Fund, and also Chair of the Rockies Venture Institute. And I just want to give you really quickly just a little bit of the background about how we have been thinking about this, and then we will go into our panelists and they will share their perspectives. But this came about and we started thinking about from Rockies Venture Club's position, what are the things that drive how we should be talking about this topic? And anybody who has ever been involved with venture capital, either as somebody raising capital or investing as an angel or a VC, you know it's one of the least transparent areas of any business I know. So part of our goal is to increase that transparency. And another is that we want to be reaching out actively to founders and investors of color rather than waiting for them to come to us. We've been told as RVC, we want to make sure we're not in a bubble, just sort of doing our own thing. The other is we want to provide education to both minority entrepreneurs and investors to increase investment, plan for the long run sustainable programs, be data driven, measure success, and listen to the community and make no assumptions. Hence this session today. This was the action plan we came up with. Was we're working with the WEDIT, Colorado's Economic Development Agency, to work toward activating investors of color. We work with the Colorado Minority Business Office, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Black Chamber of Commerce, Minority and Women's Chamber Coalition, with James at the Hispanics in Technology, And we also used racial resilience as a big part of our conference, our annual Colorado Capital Conference last month in resilience. And then finally, we're working with sponsors to investigate support where we can offer investors and founders of color free access to all of RVC's workshops and classes. So with that, I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panelists and then allow them to elaborate further on their backgrounds and talk about how they think about this topic. So first, we have up James Foy, founder of Hispanics in Tech. We'll have Denise Caleb from Talent Plus, and I'm just going to move this over a little bit. Don Dominguez from Bridgehaven and formerly with SVB Capital. Therese Hawken, founder of and CEO of PageDip, and she has a background in corporate as well as being a startup. Eddie Cohen, president, chief executive of Urban League, and Richard Lewis, founder of RTL Networks, and too many things to list here, but super impressive, every single one of these folks. So with that, I'm going to turn off my share and give it over to James Foy, Hispanics in Tech.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I'll probably say this multiple times. You are making a difference. We need to give Peter and RVC props for the courage to step outside their bubble and authentically represent and being willing to listen, not only with the ears, but with the heart to try to make a difference. What you're doing cannot be understated. So my name is James Foy. My family's been here in Colorado over 100 years. On my mother's side, I'm Hispanic. We came here 100 years ago working the fields, literally. We were redlined. I've personally been involved in startups and tech for over 20 years. I founded Hispanics in Tech about 2.5 years ago on one premise. I got tired of being the only Hispanic in the room. I also got tired of seeing my family, other people of color, slip through the cracks and not having access to the right things. So I founded Hispanics Tech, economic empowerment. Hispanics, 6% of tech community only get 1%, 1.5% of all VC Latinas get less than half of 1%. That needs to change. It's going to change by being authentic. In Hispanics in Tech, 3 things. If you don't like loud voices, may not be your place. Don't want raw emotion, you're going to struggle. Don't want to be interrupted, you might think twice. And the reason I said that is, as the premise is, so when you come, it's authentic representation. And the third part, I mean, I know many of these panelists on here. We've fought together, we fought with each other, everything. But we know the power of giving back. So the third premise of Hispanics in Tech is like, we know the privilege we are to sit here and we will give back to the community. Do you want me to go into the challenges, Peter?
Sure, please.
To me, with Hispanics in Tech, it's been a grassroots. So before COVID, I would be the one going to all the networking. I've worked with Eddie for years. I've known Rich for years, Denise, and I've known each other for multiple decades. We grew up across the street from each other. I cannot explain the amount of respect I have for these people or admiration. But we know the struggles of finding communities of color in tech and the startup world. They're not out there, or they're not out in industries which would normally get VC. If you look at the current trend, there's Hispanics and African Americans are studying a significant amount of business, but they're not the traditional VC. So getting people to think about it, creating a pipeline, and the most important, authentically representing them. The opportunity is Hispanics. Right now, we're approximately 20+% of the population. Soon we will be a minority majority. If you want to tap that market, if you want to make money, you either invest in the community or not. I mean, to be blunt, our numbers will speak. Demographics rule. The opportunity is also the heart. Listen to everybody on this panel. We know what we see. I don't want to get into too much of it. We can tell you the statistics of incarceration. We can tell you everyone. We know what things like Peter are doing can change that dynamic, and that's why I'm doing it. I'm sorry about shaking the screen.
Okay, thanks, James. Appreciate that. Great perspective. By the way, I'll just point out, I just sent a note to everybody. We'll have a chance for everybody on this call, above and beyond the panelists, to have a say in this as well. So, so be gathering your questions for panelists as well as your own observations on barriers and solutions. I'm going to apologize. I'm not going to follow the exact order I did on my introductory slides, but next I'd like to have Sharice Hawkins, CEO of PageDip, go. And the reason I'd like you to go first, Sharice, is you're somebody who has been going through this process of fundraising, for quite some time and have been successful. And I think you've got some stories from the trenches and, would really have valuable stuff to share.
Certainly. I actually did quite a bit of reflecting on this over the past week and this weekend specifically when I was invited to be a part of the panel. And I think it's important what James said about being as authentic as possible. So I'm bringing my best self with my authentic self, no holds barred. So the three things that I thought about were, first of all, affinity bias and how we can overcome affinity bias. We all have that bias and it can show up in many different ways. The second one is, as Peter mentioned, last year we did our second fundraising effort, and it was very clear to me that it took at least twice the amount of time to raise what would arguably be half as much of what we expected and what some of our what other statistics for non-people of color would have expected. I will say that I have to put a plug in for RVC. The process in working with RVC, who was a part of that raise, was transparent, was consistent, and I think allowed us to really understand where we were. There was so much less ambiguity in working with RVC, and I think that's one of the things that they provide to any entity that goes through their process. That said, when we looked at the number of followers in the deals and the organizations that we worked with, they would have indicated a much higher amount of a raise than we actually ended up closing. And I have some thoughts about why that is and how that could be improved. And the last thing that I feel very strongly about is access. I think about, I had the pleasure of being one of the female entrepreneurs of color who was featured in a national magazine. And the point of that article was how few women of color have raised more than $1 million. And every conversation I had with this group was around access, not only to capital, but to the caliber of mentors and how the bar can get raised as you're going through this journey. So the one small story I'll share is I remember speaking to an investor very early before our first raise, and they said, when you have $20,000 MRR, come back and talk to me. That's where the conversation really gets interesting. So it took me a while. It took me maybe longer than other entrepreneurs to get to that 20K MRR. And by the time I went back, that same investor said, "Oh, well, that was a year and a half ago. Now the bar is 40,000 to 50,000 MRR." And so I've seen that kind of experience play out multiple times where, maybe you were the first to get off the starting line. And so it's really hard to catch up with expectations moving forward. And that can really affect decisions that investors make. So happy to dive into all three of those, but those are the ones that came to mind as I reflected on this panel. And I'm really happy to be here and speak as honestly and bluntly as I'm capable.
Appreciate that. That was awesome. So I would be curious to know just your thoughts about the size of that closing and what goes on in the background to make that closing smaller for you than for others, comparable companies.
I have had people tell me confidentially, and I will be clear that it was not from the RVC community, but from other communities, that the numbers still, with all the pushing and all of the awareness, when it actually comes down to writing a check, the amounts that people are willing to invest in people of color are less. Kind of if you look at the apples to apples, progress, traction, caliber of team. So we all have to be very appreciative of those that write checks. And so I want to be careful not to be disparaging, but given, kind of how many followers that we've had in certain deals and the conversion level and the amounts, there's definitely a difference in what you would have expected in maybe a blind comparison of similar companies and similar stage.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. So did you have any suggestions for solutions to this, these dilemmas you've laid out for us?
Of course. In each category, with affinity bias, I think there can be a tendency to talk to listen to founders of color and feel like, okay, I checked the box. I gave Cherise some time. I had coffee with her. All businesses run because they are financially sustainable. So I would look each and every person who's interested in supporting, for some entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color, to buy. Being a paying customer is the largest, the biggest way to help an organization, in addition to the mentoring. And then in terms of the awareness around perhaps those discrepancies in terms of raising, taking twice as long to raise half as much, and the bars that are being set that might have changed, and understanding that the resources and the access for those people of color may provide some unseen barriers to meeting those same milestones. And the last piece around access to networks, we had an experience very recently where we realized that our collateral was not, in a particular area, was not up to the standards that I believed it should be. And I thought about the connections that I have to find a fantastic graphic designer, for example, very, very quickly, or to have the uncle who happens to have a spare $100,000 that can invest. My network looks very, very, very different than the other entrepreneurs, even in the Boulder community. And so the time and effort it takes to fill those very two different slots, the uncle that can give you a loan really quick when you're in a bind, and being able to have access to some of the resources that I think some people can take for granted. My network looks really, really different than many of the CEOs and founder friends that I know that are not of color or not female.
Yeah. Well, I think you just hit on a huge one, and that's that friends and that FFF network that supports most of these companies to get them to that 40,000 or 50,000 MRR, and that is super tough to get. Well, let's thank you, Cherise. That's awesome. So let's move on. Eddie, you're next up on my screen. Let's hear what you've got.
All right, thanks for having me here today. We'll tell folks just briefly about the Urban League. So I'm in Cincinnati right now with the Urban League of Greater Southwestern Ohio. We have the top business and development and entrepreneurship center out of our 90 affiliates across the country, serve about 1,600 businesses, and we house the Small Business Development Center at the Urban League. Thank you for the comments before. I think I was going to talk about sort of unconscious bias, but we'll start by setting the stage because I'm talking about a specific type of business. 95% of Black businesses are sole proprietorships or solopreneurs. And so there's no chamber, frequently not connected to startup weeks. So they're just kind of really literally bootstrapping. But what we learned in talking to those businesses, if we can talk about infusion of capital, we can talk about mentorship, but I would just say the evaluation process, right? When you're deciding to fund a startup or not. So there's a tremendous gap in trust when you're dealing with Black startups in general. I know this isn't always the case because we have a history of distrust, right? With institutions and traditional philanthropists, traditional startups, traditional funders, VCs, where give me all of your financials, right? Doesn't necessarily work when you're dealing with founders of color sometimes. We think about just social capital. I think the last speaker talked about that a little bit of who are your other angels? I might not have any angels. My other angel may be second mortgage on my place, right? And to create a relationship of trust where you understand it's a different context. But I will talk a little bit about, we deal with a lot of founders that specifically have products or services that service the Black community or underserved communities, right? And that have a really difficult time getting investment. And I think there's a difference between market opportunity, right, versus, let's say, for example, you have a restaurant, and there's a new concept that's a Black restaurant. Well, you say they have a 5% success rate, the market is saturated, why the hell would I invest in, a restaurant? And so in the evaluation process, I think there's a difference between, even if there's a market that's saturated, of what is tolerated versus an opportunity, right? If we think about a larger example, if Walmart was on a piece of paper and someone said, invest in it, I want to create retail space in underinvested rural areas that has no population growth, low per capita income, you're out of your mind, right? And here, what we saw there is actually an example of this. There was an urgent care that was started by a group of Black nurses here in the middle of these sort of open disparities with COVID and stuff, a market that is super saturated, 5,000% growth off the rip, right? Just because of the changes and the desires of what we see in the marketplace now. Even though it's saturated, there's still a demand and a group of consumers that tolerate things that may be open to something new. So it's just really thinking through that rubric. Continuous threats of unconscious bias. We see it. We partnered with Goldman Sachs to do PPP loans during this pandemic. And it's interesting to really see the evaluation plays out, right? What is startup and what is fluid and what's being agile versus what is unorganized. They don't have their stuff together. What's your plan from year zero to year 5, right? Of seeing when that plays out, of being conscious about it. I think that what the solutions that I would say is think about your rubric when you're evaluating what you want to invest in as an angel. I think the startup community, ironically, can learn a lot from what's happening in the transformation in philanthropy, where they've invested in things for a long time and really are saying, let's blow up this model, this traditional model, and really get closer to folks who are on the ground. I think from a startup community can learn a lot from that as well. So those were really my two, I think, previous panelists really articulated that better than me around unconscious bias and just rethinking how you evaluate a product or service.
Yeah, those were great, Eddie. Thanks so much. And I loved, just your last point about blowing up the traditional model is really interesting. I was on the session yesterday watching is about impact investing and race, and the two companies they brought up were not traditional venture capital companies. So if you looked at those as much as you'd want to as an impact investor, you couldn't invest in them using an VC model or an angel investing model. But we did something interesting in our last conference. We had a company who also didn't match that model. So we put together a revenue-based investing structure for it and took up some time in the pitch to explain what the hell is that. But that would work for this company that we just had pitch. It's called Dope Mom Life, by the way, if anybody's out there. And so that was a Black woman running this company, and great company, but just, kind of had to blow up the traditional structure. So I appreciated that comment. And then the other thing you said is just sort of this, and this is, I think, one of the big things is this concept of people who, they come to pitch, but they don't have their stuff together. Well, that's a huge problem. And, I think about that's who the hell knows how to put together a pro forma, right? With all those projections. So that's kind of what RVC has been doing with all of these classes we do, and hopefully putting together a grant program where we can offer those for free to founders of color, because back to Sharice's point, you don't always have those network connections, people who can do that for you or whatever. So I think that point was super, super important, because I will say that's quite common. So, all right. Well, thanks, Eddie. That was awesome. I'm going to move on, if it's okay, to Rich Lewis.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just had a power surge at the house, so I want to make two comments. And first, one, if we have another one, I hope we don't. I don't know what happened. The power surge knocked me out for a few minutes. I came back. So if it happens again, please continue without me. I'll join when I can. And then two is because I was out for a few minutes, if any of my comments are repetitive, I apologize in advance. So, but I did hear about unconscious bias, and I want to say that that's very real. Anyone who knows me in the community and everything, they know that typically when they see me, I'm always wearing a suit. And until coronavirus and working from home and popping into the office from time to time, many of my employees have never even seen me in a pair of jeans. There's a reason for that. Part of it is just I feel professional, but also as an African American, it's never lost on me that perception is a lot. And I always made a very conscious effort that anytime anyone sees me, I'm going to be dressed, I'm going to be sharp, and I'm going to wear my class ring from the Air Force Academy. I'm going to do everything in my power to confront in every way that I can the unconscious bias that I know is out there in so many people. And so it's real, and it's something that we live with and deal with every day. I also want to say that and a lot of times when it comes to businesses and investment, and a lot of that's based on hey, having your business together, and there's so many other issues involved. And some of the disparities, I mean, a lot of that starts in corporate America. I was in the Air Force for 10 years, and then I worked in corporate America for a few years, and then I started my firm. And a lot of my business success comes from my opportunity to work at senior levels in the Air Force. I separated as a captain, and then director level positions in corporate America. So I had a chance to see how businesses function at an organizational level in many of my experiences. That's been extremely helpful for me as a business person. And a lot of those disparities happen in corporate America. That's a great training space for future entrepreneurs. And unfortunately, a lot of these unconscious biases and other barriers limit many people of color from gaining that organizational exposure at a high level. So that if and when they start their own businesses, sometimes they lack that vision and that comprehensive exposure, and it does impact their ability to speak to their vision and to the outlook for their firm, and to talk about their forecasts and things of that nature. It makes a difference. We have to do a better job. It all tracks down to ultimately someone making a decision as to whether or not they want to invest in your firm is just how well you convey the future prospects for your firm. It's a bigger conversation than just, hey, how can we get more people with bags of money to invest in Black businesses? It's all of America that really needs to look at how we're operating and what's really happening. I'll also say that history matters. When it comes to Black businesses specifically, when you talk about trust, I heard that earlier on. I think it was Eddie who was mentioning that there's a lack of trust in from many of the minority communities into corporate America. When you look at the fact that we have 250 years of chattel slavery, followed by congressional mismanagement and the Freedom Savings Bank, which left many depositors with losses. A lot of Black-owned towns that have been blown up and wiped off the face of the earth, like Tulsa, which is one of the more popular ones, but one of the more known ones. But there were dozens of cities that suffered a similar fate. Jim Crow, Black codes. Someone was mentioning, I think it was James who mentioned, redlining and access to capital and so many other factors. Those things, those all feed into this conversation. The fact that much of the wealth in this country, when you start a business, it's just like Monopoly. You run out of money and you're done. So the fact that so much of the wealth in this country is tied up, by white males, that makes a difference, because when you're starting a company, how do you really get to a point where you're where you can attract funding, the whole access to capital, and not just through banks and lenders, but just through friends and family. It's not just the wealth, held by, white males, but it's a lot of the relationships and contacts. Not saying that everyone who is not of color, white male has, is born with, money in a trust fund and tons of connections to be had, but it is an issue. There's a serious credibility gap, and I think that a lot of these things matter. I mentioned I was in the Air Force. One of the things that you notice, and in the Air Force is really pilot driven. And when someone going through pilot training, someone embraces that young officer and says, hey, I'm going to get you some extra hours. Hey, I like you. We have similar backgrounds. We say, my parents knew your parents, whatever the connection is, you end up with a mentor. That person, supports you as you go through pilot training, as your young career. That person has the potential to be a better pilot than someone without those capabilities, not just connections and everything else, but in terms of skills. They've had more time, behind the stick. They've had more mentorship. They've gotten more advice. They've had a chance to talk to more people who've been there, done that. They become better pilots. And I think that we talk about just the disparities. That's another thing that we as African-American businesses are fighting. Just support through the whole process. So that we're competing with companies that have just had more experience, more exposure, and are theoretically better run companies. And we have to basically fight that to get our piece of this pie. I believe in Black businesses. I believe in minority business. I believe in all businesses. But when I look at the minority community and the tenacity, the fight, I really believe that you get something extra when you run into a Black business that's succeeded, and you start to hear those stories and everything that they've gone through, and not just Black, minority in general, women. You get something special, and we have to change that paradigm and really look at, how do we make a conscious effort to really engage and try to learn. There are a lot of incubators in town and things of that nature where money comes, looking for talent and things of that nature. But, I haven't run the statistics on them and look at the demographics, but I'd be willing to gamble that, even in those spaces, the number of African-American and minority-owned firms are, less than, the population. They're not, representative of the population. So we just have to do more to promote our businesses so that they can be on fair footing when it comes to investor money. My 2 cents. Sorry, I can't hear you, Peter. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Peter.
Sorry, I should know not to mute myself. Anyway, I said that's way more than 2 cents worth, Rich. That's awesome. Gosh, there's so much there to dig into. And I'll just say, I've sort of seen this thing about like the pilots getting the mentoring and the extra hours and all of that. I would agree. That's the kind of thing we need for Black entrepreneurs. To have those sort of internal mentor networks, things like that, that can sort of, again, getting back to this transparency issue, it seems like there's so many things that are not obvious for somebody just walking down the street. But if you have a mentor who has been through all of this and can just walk you through things, I think that makes a world of difference. And it's, not just mentoring, but I mean, just sort of somebody who's there all the way along and, able to provide all that good advice. So let me throw this back to you because I'm curious. One of my theses is that, and I want to turn all these things into action that we're talking about, that a group like Rocky's Venture Club who has, frankly, we've invested in a number of Black-led companies, but we have, I don't know if we even have any, but very few, if any, Black investors. So we don't have that trust, the look of trust. We look like a lot of people who look like me, frankly. And I think one of my theses is having people who look like you in this group, I think will do two things. One, provide that mentoring network and ability to sort of hold somebody by the hand, but also, just to say this is a welcoming place that, somebody could go to, and at least in this one narrow niche, there is an element of trust. Somebody could, because I totally get that. I feel like there's barriers around us that we can't even see. So I appreciate actually all of you have kind of talked about that. And I'm not quite sure how to put that into action other than engaging more Black and brown investors in the community. So I'd be curious to hear what you think about that aspect of that solution.
Sure. I think that's a very valid point. I mean, there are a lot of us who are investing in our community and in our businesses, but at smaller levels. We don't have the millions of dollars in time and energy. We're not in. There are a lot of people who sold their businesses and gone on to become venture capitalists in the community. They'd be really good people to talk to. I'd be happy to discuss this further with you. And there are people in the community, I don't know, we could reach out to Robert Smith and people who are like that in our community and see if they'd like to get involved in this conversation. He's come out with, I know that he's come out with several statements where he is, investing in the community. So maybe that's, a place of trust where we could start. Let's talk about it. I'm happy to lend my name and my company and commit a certain amount of funds to try and invest. But there's so many organizations. There are microfunders. There's community development funds. There are grants. There are just so many things out there already.
Yeah.
How do we create a roadmap for some of our minority businesses who maybe haven't had mentorship, who say, have you talked to this organization? You need to spruce up your business plan, and here's a group that can help you. How do we create a roadmap that builds trust too? If we were to have a roadmap of, hey, this is where you can go for help getting your business up to speed. This is where you can go for financing. Just to show interest in helping companies grow their capacity and it can start with conversations and education, versus leading with the dollars.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think one of the things that I've observed as an angel investor and somebody who invests with groups is that the numbers are stacked against people like Charisse who are trying to raise money, because you're getting checks $10,000, $25,000 at a time. And you're smiling. I know this is, and it takes, 10, 20 pitches to get one of those. And the average raise is $1 million or even $500,000. And that's 40 people writing $25,000 checks. And it's just like Groundhog Day over and over and over again. And I think sort of angel investing 101 is individuals writing those checks. And I think that's great. But I think for the minority community to get to really make itself have impact and get beyond the smaller checks that Charisse was talking about, or smaller aggregate checks anyway, this idea of building syndicate networks is important, so that 1, 2, 3, 20, 30 people can get involved in a deal.
If I can raise my hand, I'd like to expand on that just a little bit. In the Black community, we kind of look at Oprah and Magic Johnson, and a bunch of others, and kind of feel like, we're doing so much better. And, there is money in our community at this point, but it's really, when you look at it at scale, it's pretty, and it's well documented that the economic divide now is as wide as it was in 1968. Sure, we have Oprah and others, but then they had Madam C.J. Walker and others back in the 20s. And, the wealth gap is just as wide as it's ever been. I think the average Caucasian family is worth about 150K, where the Black family is worth about 13. The last thing I looked at.
Yeah.
So raising money, these capital raises, I mean, we don't all know Jay-Z, right? So, how do we get, people who can write those level of checks? There are very few people in our community that can write those $25,000 checks. And for those who can, we can only do so many before we go down ourselves, right? So how do it has to be a broader community conversation. Getting back to what you were saying, how does RVC kind of, get engaged and become more of a trusted entity? I'm just going to go back. I'm going to try and phrase it a little better than I did earlier and just say, like in anything, it's the process is know, like, trust. First, they have to know you. Then they get to a point where they kind of see what you're about and they like what you're doing, and then they start to trust you. So we just have to get you involved in more conversations like these, get you involved in more minority chambers, get you into more community conversations where, people get to see you and know what you're about.
Yeah, appreciate that. That's spot on. I'm seeing our time is just flying by, as I knew it would. James has a quick one, and then we're going to go to Denise, who will talk to us more from the HR point of view and the people and teams side of things. So,
well, Rich, thank you again for being the leadership. We've met well over a decade ago. And if there's a foundation we're building between at least Brown and Black communities, you're one of the bedrocks, unquestionably. You've been very open, supporting my efforts as well as others. So we need to give you proper credit. But one thing I think you're hearing from everybody else, and I'll eventually get back to it, and you brought it up earlier, it's like when you engage Brown and Black investors, don't expect us to always code switch. When you want to hear us, let us be authentic. Let us be real. That's how the trust is built up. We may come across emotional, like when I was hitting this. That's what you expect. I mean, John is on here. John has seen the highest level of financing. He's seen challenges at the biggest syndicates, and he can speak to it. Eddie, I mean, we have an amazing panel here. I mean, when we step up, I'm learning a lot. I mean, I apologize, my emotions got ahead of me, but Rich, you're dead on, and you need to get credit for everything you've done.
Thanks, James. Denise.
Hi, my name is Denise Caleb, and I'm going to get a little bit of a different slant. I come from the HR world. I work at Talent Plus, and we are a global human resources and business management consulting firm located in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm located here in Colorado, and when I think of the barriers that we've been talking, I agree with many of the ones that were shared. I also think that there's that the barrier, and one of the things that we're doing today is very beneficial, is the awareness and the education. So thank you, Peter, and thank you, James, for inviting me to be a part of this, because that is, I believe, where we've got a disadvantage in the Black and Brown community is just around awareness and education. The other piece is what we've talked about, not just the business plan, but there's a lot of great concepts and visionaries in the Black and Brown community, but how do you take that concept and move it to an effective business plan with all the different supports that are needed to communicate that business plan in a way that looks very attractive to investors? And so Sharice, you spoke to that as having that access to resources. And then with that access, making sure that we create, Peter, you touched on this, you talked about mentorship, but taking it to that next level of allyship and then sponsorship. How do you sponsor? How do you truly invest in someone? Not just a brief mentor kind of dialogue, but how do I make sure I'm sponsoring you over a 6-month period or a year period and getting you with the right resources and connections to be able to move forward. I know many people have talked about unconscious bias, and you've asked us to be our authentic self. And we've got to be real that there's implicit, and there are individuals that are consciously being biased. They just don't want to do business with people who don't look like them. That is that's a barrier to this. And we've got to be real about that. That's real talk. It's the reality that if you don't look like me, I might not want to do any exchange of financials with you. But the solutions to this, and this is where I'll give everyone a different optic to look through, is when I look at it from the human resources side, a lot of our clientele have our venture capitalists, private equity, angel investors. We have those individuals. We have a lot of small startup and small businesses that are a part of our portfolio. And where we've been able to help as a business is to say, let's look at this from a different angle. Let's look at it from a talent factor. I mean, there's the business plan, there's the business mindset, the business acumen, the executive skill to be able to come to the table and present yourself as a viable business. But then do you have the natural talent to be able to move that forward? And that's where we come in at Talent Plus, and we partner with our small businesses and our angel investors so that they have a different way of assessing whether or not they want to invest in a business. And so we do that off of natural attributes, looking at how is this person naturally wired, and will they have the work intensity and the level of business acumen to move this business forward over time. And so we call that the talent factor, and that's what our business is based off of. That is being a part of that evaluation process, and with a different lens, because often we're making judgments about a lot of things that people can practice. And if you have the resources, it's not that some of the concepts that people are bringing to the table or the vision around a business, it's not that they're any less quality, it's just how they get packaged then is what gets judged. And so we take out that layer and say, let's look at what the person is going to be able to do, their level of capabilities and their natural talents, and then how are they going to be able to move the business forward. And so that's an assessment piece. The other piece is the readiness. As we know in the Black and Brown community, so many of our entrepreneurs are also entrepreneurs, meaning that they're doing both. They're already going to their day job, and then second shift is running that second business because they have to create that foundation to be able to eventually move from having the day job to going full time with their startup. And so look at that, and let's provide some credibility to individuals who are sometimes doing double time, triple time, and they're already showing great success if they are also an entrepreneur and an entrepreneur. So just something to consider. And then also generational wealth. There's a lot of ways to invest. You can invest by starting a business. You can create an opportunity for your family, but then how do we assist individuals in the Black and Brown community to say, it doesn't have to be a startup or a business that you go out and a new venture. It could be, how do you make your own investments with the company that you're working for, making sure you're accessing your 401k and you're accessing your IRAs. There are so many ways to invest. And again, it comes back to awareness and making sure people have the foundation, the sponsors that can help you to think of, how do I make generational wealth, not just for my family today, but for that next generation of individuals that are in my family lineage, that I want them to see the same successes that I have.
That is awesome. I just want to pick up on two things that you said that were super important. And I think, when people start companies, they usually start by looking around themselves and seeing gaps in the market, gaps among incumbents. And then they're like, I'm going to start a company that fills those gaps. And I think, that, you, Denise, and Rich, John, Eddie, Charisse, everybody, all of you have had a chance to work in large organizations. So you've had a chance to see big gaps as opposed to, we need a food truck on this block. And I think when it comes to venture capital, that bigness and the ability to scale, and you talked about going from concept to business plan, is really important. But what's interesting is a lot of times you can look at something small, and with the right strategy and somebody who's got that bigness, they can turn that to scale, and then you've got a deal you can actually do, an angel investment in. So I think those are super important things. And the thing that jumped to mind with what you were talking about with building diverse teams is, any VC will tell you the team is the number one thing they look at when they're investing. And so getting those right people, if you don't have that expertise in finance or marketing or technology, then hiring those folks on, getting them to join you is obviously super important.
Absolutely.
I want to jump to John because that's all right. I saved you to the last, John Dominguez, and we'll have time to have you get in a thing. We've gone longer. Folks who are online, if you want to type in questions, we can all see that and respond. But I do want to give John a good time because I know he has touched so many deals that you've got lots of different perspectives and no doubt dozens of stories.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here, and it's great to hear all these personal stories. I appreciate everybody opening up and talking about unconscious bias. I think that one of the big difficulties with what's going on in terms of racism and unconscious bias and so forth is everybody just has a different experience. Even Latinos have different experience. Black people have different experience. I was born in a pretty low-income neighborhood in Denver, but my parents' decision to move us out to the white suburbs in the 70s, I grew up in Littleton and was predominantly a white neighborhood. My high school class was probably 90% white. I went on to CU, and undeniably, that experience creates unconscious bias in me. And it's important that we talk about that and we all have an awareness of our own biases and how it impacts our decisions and the pathways that we get in life. I want to talk a little bit about the venture capitalist because I've spent my career, for the most part, investing in venture capital funds. I had a very unique opportunity to do that for the state of Colorado Retirement Fund in the late 90s. I joined them in 1995 and was the director of alternative investments there. So I've got a 25-year history of investing in funds and watching the venture capital industry evolve. Back then, we used to get a quarterly report from Venture Economics that would show the number of women VC partners and the number of women CEOs that were backed by venture capitalists. While I was there, that number never got above 3%. There were never more than 3% of the industry was women, and there were never any venture-backed CEOs. That number never got above 3%. Today, obviously, that's changed a lot, and I wanted to talk about how the VC industry has evolved a little bit. I also want to talk briefly about the Kauffman Fellows, and because I think that's a good example of things that have worked to combat gender bias and also racial bias. And then I want to kind of talk about some specific work and research that they've done that sort of validates, it's not newsworthy, it sort of validates these disparities. And, Charisse, it was interesting to hear your comments about your challenge in raising capital. This research that they've done, validates that what your experience isn't just anecdotal. This is female founders and ethnically diverse founders have a much harder time raising capital. We all know that, but the statistics bear it out. But there's also some encouraging news and developments that research has bared out I want to talk briefly about. First of all, on the VCs, and Al Guerrero tomorrow, if you guys have a chance to see the seminar tomorrow, Al Guerrero from SVB is going to talk a little bit about this, but I think the VC industry has sort of evolved in three different waves. VCs have been around since the 70s and 80s. It's actually one of the oldest forms of private investment around. And back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, it really wasn't an institutionalized business. It was wealthy people investing in venture capital, maybe some endowments. And for the most part, all of those VC funds were white dominated. I mean, literally, 99% white male. And the next iteration of VC funds came about when the industry started to get institutionalized and institutional capital. For example, me being at the state of Colorado looking to put money into venture capital funds. And as we started to see institutionalization, the VCs wanted to go to the universities to recruit talent, associates and analysts, people that they could groom into the role of being a venture capitalist. And for the most part, they all kind of went to the Ivy League schools. And so the talent pool, if you will, that they were drawing upon to increase their ranks was also very, racially biased, predominantly white. And the Kauffman Fellows program that came around 27 years ago was set up to really kind of change that. And they have been made a huge impact at bringing women into the VC industry and also people of color into the VC industry. And I want to talk about that. But the third and most recent wave of VCs, and this is really important, are not these sort of Ivy League, country club folks of yesteryear. They're founders. They're people who have actually started companies, have had success as an entrepreneur, and now they want to actually reinvest their wealth into startups. And so naturally, that third wave is just more ethnically diverse. It's still very much white biased. The statistics play that out. But we are seeing a new generation of venture capital fund manager that's coming more with an operational founder background than the traditional Ivy League. And I think that's going to really help and make a difference in getting more capital funded into ethnically diverse startups. I think the one thing that this data that the Kauffman Fellows has shown is that there was always a mythology around, it's always the elephant in the room. Why are there no people of color in VC funds? And there was always a mythology around, people of color just aren't as educated as whites. We just don't have as many of them graduating from four-year colleges. And so naturally, that's the problem. That myth has completely been debunked by the work that the Kauffman Fellows has done, because we know today that Blacks and Latinos and Asians are increasing in terms of their educational achievements. They're getting more degrees, whereas whites are actually declining. And so there's been a major shift in the talent pool, but yet we haven't seen that find its way into the VC ranks as of yet. And I think it's really important that we get Latinos, Blacks, and women people starting companies, because there's evidence that once they get funded, both female and ethnically diverse startup teams, once they get funded, they have a much higher success rate of raising follow-on capital, and they actually do better. The metrics on the results are superior. So it's not just a good idea to invest in ethnically diverse teams and gender diverse teams from an ethical standpoint. It's a good idea because it actually works. It makes better returns. And there's just not enough awareness around that. I think in terms of solutions going forward, I think James and what he's doing with Hispanics in tech is a really good example of things that we can do here locally around even just creating awareness around the startup community and what it is. And we Latinos and Black young people just don't even have so little awareness of what this is. And I think there's going to be opportunities to do more with media and social media to get that community just aware of the opportunities that exist, so that we see more of them coming in and having more curiosity about it. I think that James and Hispanics in Tech is a gateway for that. And I think the Kauffman Fellows organization, what they've done, both in terms of sourcing ethnically diverse talent and gender diverse talent into the industry, but not just sourcing it, but creating a mentorship and a networking framework around it, is really, really powerful. And I think that it's not just getting it started, but sort of keeping it going and giving people of color the network effect that they can have in terms of helping each other and supporting each other. For Latinos, James talked about this earlier, they make up 18% of the population today, of the working population, but only 2.6% of the, in terms of venture representation in venture-backed startups. They are the most underrepresented community, just behind Blacks in terms of that aspect. Asians are actually overrepresented in VC. They actually represent 6% of the population, but they're 16% of the working class in the venture ecosystem. So they have been able to achieve that. There's no reason Latino Americans and Black Americans can't have that same success, but we have to learn from them and emulate the things that they're doing as well.
That's awesome. Thanks, John. I like that mic drop, John. Saved you for the last. I don't know if you saw that in the comments. That was good. I just want to, we have to wrap up now. We're at 3 minutes over. I'm sure Emily's going to be coming in here in just a second, kicking us all off. But I do want to say there's just two things. One is this idea of network effect is super important. And I think the more we can speed that up, broaden it, make that happen. Otherwise, it takes generations. And a lot of the problems we're facing in dealing with unconscious bias, race, and all of these things, it's generational. And so we have to do a lot of things now to be doing this faster, doing it better, and looking at what we can do today to accelerate that. So that's super important. And I'll just say we have one investor at RVC who only invests in women-led companies. And he cites the statistic that you stated, John, and it's not just because he's a nice guy, it's because those companies in the portfolios are doing very nicely. So good insights. So with that, I would just love, I wish this was a 2-hour session because we've all gotten to cover the high points here, and I'm sure we could dig in deep on any of, I've been taking notes all along. And so I just want to say thank you to Charisse and Eddie, James, Denise, Rich, and John. I've gotten a lot out of this, and I hope the participants have as well. And these will be things I will promise you we will put into action at RVC. So this is super valuable. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Emily, who I'm sure is waiting in the wings to do the sign-off stuff. And
Peter, again, I could speak for Eddie.
Oh,
I could
yeah,
speak
thank
for
you.
Denise.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Just real quickly, you are making a real impact. Please do not let, for the people still on the call, please do not let his humility understate his work, his dedication to communities of Black and Brown. Please do not. Peter took chances with me. He's taking chances with other people. Peter's putting his skin in the game. So please give him credit.
All right. It's all yours, Emily. Thank you, James. Appreciate that.